Hey everyone, welcome to today's podcast on Saints and Society. I am your host today, Rick, and I have our guest on board with us, Brad Leibold. And today we're going to be talking about the podcast, on this podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a podcast that you can go and listen to, one that's done by a guy named Mike Cosper. But more than just talking about that podcast and how Christians respond to that, we're talking about the local church and what the local church is, and about the hurt that has been even caused by the local church. And so hope that you'll tune in and listen to today's podcast as we dive into this.
You are listening to Saints in Society, a podcast focusing on equipping saints to live in and engage with their society. As we dive into the Word and with help from experts in their field, we seek to learn how to engage culture in its terms, but not on them. We believe the gospel speaks to all of life and provides the answers we are all looking for, so we aim to equip saints with the tools necessary to apply the gospel to all areas of life, living as saints in society.
Brad, we've known each other for a few years now, hunting partners. When you were in high school, what CDs would I have found in your CD collection? Because I don't know this about you.
Okay. There would have been Josh Turner, the Long Black Train album, some Tim McGraw, Alan Jackson, George Strait. So a lot of like classic good country.
Okay.
Rodney Adkins.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, Rodney Adkins. And but then also, so there was that side of thing, the countryside, but then also my family listened to a lot of like contemporary Christian music.
Okay.
And so some Newsboys, like back when they were Australian.
Yeah.
1,000 Foot Crutch, Casting Crowns, Mercy Me. So nothing against that stuff, but I'm more embarrassed to say that I listened to that than
Country
George
music.
Strait. Yeah.
Okay.
Who, the king of country. So where I grew up, we had 3 radio stations: country, pop, or, pop, I guess, and Christian. And all summer long, you're in the tractor for hours a day. And you have 3 options. And I was like a good little legalistic Christian kid. And so I wouldn't listen to the pop station because that one had bad words that would get bleeped out or whatever. And so Christian and country. And so, but then you're listening to music all day long and they start playing the same songs. And so you got to go back and forth between those two. But,
yeah. And like country music isn't legalistic.
Right. they say the same exact things in like pop songs. They just say it with a Southern twang.
Yeah.
And so it sounds more pure.
Mm-hmm.
But what was in your collection? CD collection, or was it 8 tracks back then?
Yeah, that's a good joke. Did you come up? You've been preparing for that one?
No, that was spontaneous.
Yeah.
I'm proud of it.
So I would play this in my Walkman.
Okay.
Thank you.
I had one of those.
Yeah. Actually, my CD collection consisted primarily of 2 genres of music. So in my CD book, you would find George Strait, Garth Brooks, Clint Black, Clay Walker, some of those. Right next to them was going to be Too Short, Tupac, DMX, Eminem, Chronic 2000, Dr. Dre, of course, and that. So I was like, just a confused kid. And then I also secretly liked a lot of stuff that I listened to, but with my windows up. Like I really liked boy bands, but not with my other friends in the car. Right. I like Nickelback, though no one ever wants to admit that. And I liked a lot of that stuff too. So, but
everyone who says they don't like Nickelback is a liar. Everyone at one point in their life was like,
I know Zach, who's recording this right now, probably legitimately doesn't like Nickelback. That's my guess. I'm speculating. He can weigh in on that later.
Yeah. I think everyone has a soft spot in their heart for Nickelback.
Can I tell you something hurtful that someone at the gym told me once?
Sure.
You know this person, so I'm not going to mention his name.
Okay.
But I walked in the gym and he said, "Hey, Rick, you're a lot like Nickelback." And I was like, "What does that mean?" He goes, outwardly, everyone says that they hate you. and no one likes you, but inwardly we kind of secretly do. And I was like, oh, thanks.
Is that a compliment or an insult?
Yeah.
Or both?
I think both.
No.
Today, Brad, we're going to dive in and talk through a podcast that has come out recently, but more specifically, you want to talk through how do we navigate some of the pain and hurt and everything that has come out of unhealthy churches, unhealthy leaders, unhealthy pastors, and all of that. So it's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of material to cover. But what led to us, in a sense, recording a podcast on this subject was the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And the fact that though we are doing a podcast under Saints in Society, you and I are both pastors at an Acts 29 church. And so what do we do with this? Yeah. There's this organization called Acts 29. There's this podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which has exposed a tremendous amount of unhealth under this man named Mark Driscoll. So much so that even, I think some people even have a hard time talking about it or even saying the name out of still a culture of fear. And so I just want to first openly admit that our church that I was a part of in Reno was Acts 29, but we are also Mars Hill Church for a while. And I want to admit that I haven't listened to all of it.
Okay.
And so I'm turning to you, the expert
I don't know about that.
That's listened to all of it and would love to hear even where do we start with something like this?
Yeah.
Because people are listening to it. People are coming to us. People are asking questions. And so because we're not just talking to pastors that are listening. We're talking to people who have been hurt. And so what do our listeners do? What do we do? How should we listen to this? How should we approach this? How should pastors approach it? So all of that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to back up and start with just talking about the church. Because since the church's inception, since Jesus rose from the grave and commissioned his apostles to go start churches, to plant churches, to gather people into these local assemblies where they were worshiping Jesus and sharing the gospel, the church has had issues. Is it Augustine who said the church is a whore, but she's my mother? And so there's always been this tension throughout church history, where the church is the bride of Christ. The church is necessary, but the church has issues. And so even look at the churches that Paul was writing to in the New Testament. The church in Corinth. You read through 1 Corinthians and you have celebrity pastors that people are worshiping instead of Jesus. You have egregious sexual sin that people are not calling out, and they're allowing to perpetuate, and they're even kind of like celebrating it. You have the church deliberately excluding people from the table, from the Lord's Supper. So one of the first churches that was planted that Paul is writing to has a lot of the same issues that we see in churches today. They just take on a different flavor. And so you have these churches with issues. You also have passages that talk about what the church is. And so Ephesians 5, Paul is talking about marriage, and he's relating the love of the husband to their wife as Christ's love for the church. And just listen to what he says. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So Jesus loves the church as his bride, and he, through his death, has cleansed her, so that she is without spot and without wrinkle and without blemish, holy and blameless. That is true of the church. And yet the church has issues, and the church has always had issues, and the church always will have issues. And so I think that's where Augustine's quote of the church is a whore, but she is my mother. There's this tension that we experience in the church where she's my mother. I love her. There's an affection for the church because of Jesus's love for it. And then there's the mix of that with but also she's got problems, like there's a lot of issues there. So that's been a tension held throughout church history. And then you enter into the age of the internet and podcasts, and all of the sudden these types of issues can just get way more attention than they maybe could have 100, 200, 300 years ago, throughout church history. And so you have a podcast like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill that tells a story that I think really needs to be told, a story of narcissism and pastoral abuse, spiritual abuse, and a story of a lot of hurt and pain, and trauma even that people experienced being a part of that. So it's a story that needs to be told. And I think in this particular podcast, it's told really well. I think the podcast you won't find a better like quality production wise podcast on something like this out there as far as like in Christian podcasts. But while you're hearing that story told, we have to like weigh that tension between, okay, yeah, the church has issues here. The church has the same issues it's always had. They just take on a new face. And yet I love the church. The church is the bride of Christ. And so you asked, where do we start with that? I think we have to start with, well, what is the church, and a reminder of that.
Yeah. I like what you did, because what you did is take something that's individually true for all of us. We have this tension. It's called saints in society.
Mm-hmm.
We are broken people, but that's not our core true nature. We are saints who struggle with sin. We are not sinners struggling to become saints.
Yeah.
And so individually, we can admit that we know that we're supposed to live a life that displays the holiness of Christ, but that we fall short of that every day. And that Christ's work on the cross is sufficient to atone, pay for, forgive, all of that. And so we live in this tension of that we're simultaneously sinless before God, but we're also simultaneously living out a sinful nature as well.
Yeah.
And then you bring a bunch of people together with that same identity, and you have the local church.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really good point. It's easy to think of the church as an institution or a building or a name, a vision, a budget. It's this entity that exists apart from me. And that's not what the church is. The church is just a gathering of saints. Like when we accuse the church, we're not accusing this like institution that exists on its own. Like it's a group of people. It's a group of gathered saints. And now there's institutional structures and organization that help the church function in some ways. But at the end of the day, what the church is a gathering of people. The word ecclesia, church, means gathering.
Yeah.
It's a group of individual saints that come together to make up the body of Christ.
So I don't know this because I haven't asked you this.
Okay.
Why did you feel the need to start with defining first the local church? Is there something in the podcast that leads you to go, hey, I think we need to start here?
Yeah, I would say, well, I think anytime we talk about church in general, it's helpful to start with what even is it, because we can start talking about things that aren't even the church. Like I just said, an institution versus a gathering of people. But I do say, as far as bringing this up in the conversation about the podcast, and I would say, I don't know if this is a critique of the podcast, because I don't think this is what The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill like set out to do. But I think there was a lack of comparing what we saw unfold at Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll to the ideal that a picture of church that's painted in Scripture. So I don't know, and someone can fact check me and call me out if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think that Scripture was ever opened in the podcast and like pointed out of like, okay, here's this bad example of church leadership and elders and pastors and all this kind of stuff. Here's what Scripture has to say about what church should be, and like this compare and contrast that I think it would be helpful. And again, it probably wasn't the intent of a story journalism podcast to compare this like theological thing. But as Christians who are consuming something about a theological thing, we have to start with our theology on what the church is.
Yeah, that's good. So with that said, let me dive into some of this.
Yeah.
What are the things that you liked about the podcast that you found helpful? What are the things that you dislike or maybe disagreed with?
Yeah. things I like I said, production value or quality is like off the charts good. I think Mike Cosper does a really good job putting the episodes together, narrating the story, interviewing people. It's captivating. I mean, these episodes are long. The last two are like 2.5 hours, and you can listen to that straight through because it's done so well, which I think is good. I think sometimes this is like a whole nother podcast we could talk about. Sometimes Christians make bad art because we're weird. We should almost do a podcast about that. And I think this is an example of Christians producing really good art, like with high production value and quality. And so I think that's really good. I also think it does a good job of naming sin and injustice, which is, I think, something we need to do. And so whatever is said on this podcast, don't ever hear me or us saying that the sin and injustice that was done at Mars Hill is justifiable or okay or anything like that, because I think stories like this need to be told to increase a greater awareness of the abuses of power that can happen in the local church. And so narcissism and narcissistic leadership is unfortunately very common in the local church. In fact, I think the role of pastor, for some reason, draws narcissistic people to it. And so I think for the pastors listening to this podcast, it's a really good, and it has been for me, a really good like temperature check of like, okay, like I'm not as dynamic and gifted as Mark Driscoll is, and so I'm never gonna have a 15,000 person church. But does there I could still have some of the same tendencies and like sin patterns in my own heart that are just not any better per se. They just can't manifest themselves in the same way as him with his personality and everything. And so I think it's a good, like a mirror, like a reflection for pastors and church leaders to think, okay, are there things here that we need to evaluate, like self-evaluation, and then also for church members to be aware of the ways that church leadership can be abusive, and to have those stories out there and to name sin and injustice, I think is really, really good and beneficial, and I think necessary, because I think a lot of this stuff it could continue in the dark, but when you bring this stuff to light, then it can, there's hope that it can be stopped to some degree.
Yeah.
But I would say, though, the flip side of that point is that it has the potential to make everyone all of a sudden very skeptical of their local church and their local pastors, which I don't think would be a biblical approach to our view of the church. 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love believing all things, or love trusting all things. And so I've heard a pastor say before that like the default position for Christians towards one another is trust, not skepticism. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to this story of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, and your heart starts to grow skeptical towards your own church and your own church leaders, when there's probably not any evidence of that kind of stuff going on in your church, then I think we're probably not using some discernment as we listen to that, and allowing that story to start to shape and taint our view of our own local church. So now there's a balance here, right? Because so many people were in on Mars Hill and thought things were fine, and then they weren't. And so there's a line to walk here of being wise and discerning, and if there are injustices being done in your church, and doing what you can to call those out, but then also not being like on a witch hunt, like trying to find the injustice and find the thing. And that's another thing I would say. And I don't think this is a negative of the podcast, but a negative in a response to the podcast is we already live in a culture that loves drama and loves celebrity gossip and loves, getting the dirt on people. And we almost like take pleasure in the failure of others. And we take pleasure in the juicy drama that like we get to see out there in the world. And when I don't think that belongs in the church, I don't think that belongs in the heart of a Christian, though it's so tempting. And so listening to a story like the Mars Hill story, if we're finding ourselves like finding pleasure in the fall of this thing, if we love the drama of it, if we love the kind of gossipy nature that it can be, then I think that could potentially cause a problem. If you're waiting for the next episode of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill to drop, like you're waiting for the next episode of The Bachelor, like there's I think there's a problem there.
Yeah. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but how much, I mean, we're doing a podcast right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So how much does even like podcasting and elevating men to a position of celebrity status? And because here's what I'll say, having not listened to the full podcast yet, all of them, I would say that Mark Driscoll is an incredibly, incredibly unhealthy human being who seems to have never dealt with his hurt. Hurt people, hurt other people. Okay. What I would also say is that I don't think that everything that he said and threw out was garbage.
Right.
I think that what he was trying to do in a culture like Seattle with a lot of very apathetic men was trying to challenge them and press them on issues to grow up and grow in maturity, which is very unpopular in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
But his tact, his approach, the way he did that is the problem. But I don't think that everything he was doing, because he was pushing men in ways to love their wives and do stuff. So it's not like we can throw away everything he was trying to do. It's just the way and the manner that he went about it was awful. Right.
Yeah.
But what about culture in a sense, and even Christians, like listening to so many podcasts and elevating? I mean, we're in a sense giving people a platform, Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I'll pause there.
Yeah. I see.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, we, and like I already mentioned, this is nothing new. This was happening in Corinth. We start to worship celebrity pastors when we start making people the hero instead of Jesus, then when those people let us down, and inevitably they will, then everything comes crashing down that we've built around them. And so, yeah, I think, and Mark Driscoll, he utilized the internet and social media and video production to like get his name and his brand and his messages out there. And so, yeah, we have at our fingertips the best preachers in the world. We have at our fingertips the best pastors, the best theologians that we can click a button and we're listening to the best there is out there. And when we start to idolize these men, they're going to let us down. So something that we do often, let me find it in my notes here, is we'll start by idolizing people, and then we humanize them. They get back to ground level, and then we demonize them. We put people on a pedestal and think they are God's gift to mankind, or they're God themselves. And then they do something that we're like, I'm not sure about that. They actually are just human. And then we realize how broken and sinful they are. And then we make them less than human, and we demonize them. So we have to be careful as people to not put other men and women in positions that they don't belong in. Our hope is not ultimately bound up in the success of a pastor or a leader, but ultimately in Jesus. And like Jesus is, 1 Peter 5 says, it's Christ who's the chief shepherd of the church. And if we start looking to other shepherds as our chief shepherd, they're going to let us down, and it's going to cause a lot of harm. And I think podcasts, media, social media, the internet, just the tech flooded world we live in makes that really easy for us to do. And it's tough for the local pastor who's like grinding it out every week, doing his best to write a sermon as best he can. And then your church members here are like, well, that sermon didn't really feed me this week. I'm going to listen to Tim Keller or JD Greer on the way home because I know they're good. That it causes this lack of trust and even lack of connection within local churches, because for consumeristic mentality, we can have exactly what we want tailored to our desires at our fingertips.
It's Baskin Robbins.
Yeah. Yeah. It's 32 flavors. Pick which one you want.
I thought there was 31.
Oh, I don't know. Why would they do an odd number?
So
they could have come up with one more flavor.
We'll find out how many there were later.
Okay.
This episode's local business spotlight, we're going to be looking at Sun Automotive, which is the mechanic that I go to when my car needs some love. Sun Auto started in 1977 with one store, but has now expanded to 4 stores in the Eugene area. They've been in the community for 45 years. They exist to serve their community, not only the customers they interact with on a daily basis, but also their employees. They really care about people and love to give back. The culture at Sun is to always have its ear to the ground with community involvement. During the recent Oregon fires, for example, they took the opportunity to help raise money for the communities affected. They are also launching a program this spring called Keys for Hope, which will give away a car to a family in need. Mechanics, unfortunately, are often given a bad rap for taking advantage of people, and Sun understands this. They're committed to doing the right thing every time, and they are dedicated to integrity within the industry. They keep their customers safe and on the road to enable them to live their lives. So go ahead and check out Sun Auto if you have any car troubles, and let them know that you heard about them on our podcast.
So with that, and with people having so much, at their fingertips, there's a blessing to technology, and there's a curse to it as well. What would you say, though? And I guess kind of shifting or moving on, what would you say, or let me ask you differently. How do you know? Because I think this is the problem here, is a lot of these people didn't even know that they were in such an unhealthy church.
Yeah.
Because if the current's going one way, to go against the current makes you stand out, and then you feel like, well, there's something wrong with me because everyone else seems good with what's going on here. How do you know if you're a part of an unhealthy church? And then what do you do? Or how do you, let me throw 31 questions at you now.
Yeah, please not 32.
What do you do when you are at a church like this? How do you recognize when you're at a church like this? And then I'll let you start there.
Okay. Yeah. I'd be curious your thoughts on this too, because I think you've had a little more church experience than me, but I'll say 2 things, and they're related. Is the church about Jesus?
Which is interesting, because do you want to know what Mars Hill's tagline and mission statement was?
It's probably something about Jesus.
It's all about Jesus.
Yeah. And so I would say beyond a mission statement, beyond a tagline, beyond a church name, is the church about Jesus? Or is the church about Mark or Rick or Brad? And when you ask around, when people are talking about their church, are they talking about Jesus? Or are they talking about some gifted pastor or leader or awesome program that their church does? Do you leave Sunday morning thinking, oh, what a great sermon? Or do you leave thinking, what a great Savior? Is the focus on Christ? And I think, so here's something else that I will say that I think is an indicator of if the focus is Jesus, is leadership genuinely humble and honest about failure and brokenness and weakness? Is there a level of transparency among leadership in the church that doesn't like kind of fake pseudo own their mistakes and then justify it and then gaslight and make it seem like you're the person who actually has the fault? But is there genuine, honest, humble, like self-evaluation among leadership? If there isn't, it's probably because they're more worried about their own image than they are about the gospel.
Yeah, the brand.
Yeah, and I think so. Mars Hill is like a lights flashing example of a lack of accountability at the highest level, to where there was no way to get rid of leader. Like there's no honest evaluation, and if you even like peeped some sort of criticism against, then it was like, that's not good. Like, you're done, So, yeah, I'd say, is the church beyond a mission statement actually all about Jesus? And you will see that reflected in the transparency and vulnerability of leadership, which ultimately will trickle down into the culture of the church.
Yeah, it's good. How can the church as a local body protect itself from some of these things? I mean, you are an executive pastor.
I don't have all the answers, but one thing I would say is a plurality of leadership. I think, and this is tough in some churches that are in, like, I grew up in a tiny, tiny town with a church that could barely afford one pastor, right? But there was a team of elders, and I think every church should have a team of elders, a plurality of elders that are sharing the leadership responsibility of the church, and a team of elders that can and do correct one another and call one another out. And, like, there's actual accountability that's happening there. And again, not a pseudo accountability. So I think a plurality of leadership, if the church is all about one guy, I mean, ask yourself this: if your lead pastor left, granted, that'd be difficult. I'm not going to say that's not true, but, like, would the church continue? If your lead pastor left, would 75% of the church leave as well? Would the church crumble? Would it be devastation and heartache? So I think
the other side of that would be if your lead pastor left and
you're
the church
celebrating,
celebrating, right? Yeah,
finally, yeah, that's a problem too. So there's a healthy mourning somewhere in the middle there. So plurality of leadership. I also think, again, the church is people. It's a gathering of people. If you find yourself in a church where your voice is never heard or matters or valued, that's probably a red flag as well. And it doesn't mean that every single little complaint about the color of the carpet and the songs you sing and all that kind of stuff gets the same kind of weight, but are those things heard? Are they listened to, Yeah. Is your voice valued? Or if you breathe any kind of critique against anything, if it's immediately snuffed out? And then also, is there the freedom to say those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's good.
People with Mars Hill, and I've heard it in other churches, throw out the, like, culture of fear. Like, if you ask someone, hey, have you ever considered telling the elder or talking to an elder about this? And if they were like, oh, no way would I ever, like, that's not going to go well. Like, okay, there's a reason why your people are not comfortable having that conversation with leadership. That could be a problem.
Yeah,
so
that's good. What would you say to the people listening right now that are still very skeptical, and part of that is just tied to the hurt they've experienced inside of the local church?
Yeah. First, I would say, I'm sorry. Like, truly, it breaks my heart that the church breaks people's hearts. So whatever you might be feeling is legitimate and valid, and there's very real hurt and abuse and pain that is done by and caused by churches. And so the person who's skeptical because of church hurt in the past, I would say I'm sorry. And that it really sucks that is a reality we have to deal with. I would go back, I think, to where we started and encourage you to remember what the church is. That is the bride of Christ. And as imperfect as it may be, it's still the bride of Christ that he loves. I would also say, maybe you would disagree with this, but not all churches are the same. Like, I think we get this kind of weird, like, and there's good to this, where I'm at a church, I'm committed to that church, and I'm not leaving that church. There is value in that. But there's also a lot of really great churches out there, mm-hmm. like really good churches with awesome leaders who are humble, godly men who preach the gospel and love their people well. And so just because you had one bad and probably really bad experience at one church does not mean that all churches are necessarily that way.
That's good.
Can I turn it back on you? Because you said earlier.
No.
Okay, moving on. You said that you come from you have some church hurt in your past and your story, and now you're a pastor of a church in the same network that was that brought that hurt about in the past. So what's that story been like for you?
Yeah, man. So we moved here in 2015 to plant an Acts 29 church. And we moved here with a ton of bitterness, resentment, and hurt, which is not the place you want to be at when you plant a church.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not where you want to start off. And so that's where we moved here. And a lot of that comes from the fact that we were at one time a Mars Hill church led. And if we want to use the word shepherding, though, I just don't even feel right saying that.
Yeah.
But we were led by, I'll just say that we were led by Mars Hill and by their culture. And we adopted a lot of that culture and a lot of that unhealth. Some godly men came in, older men, to walk us through a lot of that. But there was just a lot of stuff there. And I don't know that I want to publicly address all of it on a podcast. And I think that might be some of where I'm unsettled, is that I've been able to unpack this with some other people. And so that's where maybe I would agree with you that I don't know that always a podcast is the best place for that. Like, is that going to lend itself to healing?
Right.
Is it going to lend itself to people dealing with the wounds that have happened? Because that's what I want to see. Like, I needed healing and other people need healing. And I don't know if stuff like this or a podcast just stirs up more resentment and anger and bitterness. I mean, they need a place to talk, a safe place. They need to be able to name it. But for me, this was not the place to do that in the proximity of my spouse and close friends and whatnot, through counselors. I was able to do that. But I'm still a part of Acts 29. And I've seen the network shift. I've seen the network grow in health. I know the other Oregon guys and know them pretty well and can speak to their hearts. I went to a retreat when I first moved here, and I told my wife, I'm like, I'm going to find out if these guys are legit. Like, do they actually have a heart to shepherd people, or are they just a bunch of wannabe Mark Driscoll entrepreneurs, you know?
Yeah.
And I went there and I met guys that have a heart to be with the sheep, that want to smell like sheep, that want to live with the sheep, that want to actually shepherd sheep.
Yeah.
And I was encouraged by that. And I want to be a part, to even take a model from Martin Luther, is that he tried to reform the church first, the Catholic Church from the inside. So I don't want to go outside and lob stones. I want to love the family that I'm a part of so much that I can bring my voice to the table and say, guys, there's some areas we got to grow. I think every church should have a willingness to do that. When people bring stuff up, be like, is there truth in this? Are there areas we can go? Probably. Is there areas that Acts 29 can grow? Absolutely. And I hope that our network is going to continue to grow more and more healthy. And I've seen that. And I want to be a part of that. And I want because I think about it from a father's perspective. Like, how would I define like a healthy church? Do the people feel safe with their pastors? Can you go to your pastor? Can you talk to your pastor? I want my children to grow up in churches where they feel safe.
Yeah.
And I want our people to feel safe always. Like, I want people, don't you want people to know they can come talk to you?
Yeah.
And if you disagree with the sermon, or if there's something going on, or why decisions were made in leadership, do you have safety to do that? Like, do you feel safe? And so, I'm thankful to see the way the network has shifted. It's under the new leadership of the president, Matt Chandler, but also our director is Brian Howard. And I think there's areas to grow a lot. And a lot of healing and health needs to happen. But I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like you said, to love the church is to stay in it and reform it, if rather than going outside and lobbing stones, like you said, because ultimately to be a Christian, you can't escape the church. Like it's God's plan to reveal the mystery of the gospel to the nations is through the church. Yeah. That's what Ephesians 3 says. And so you can't escape the church. And so instead of the response to a bad church experience is not no church experience, but hopefully good church experience that you can be a part of. And, I've heard, I think Jonathan Leeman talks about the response to bad authority is not no authority, but good authority. And so you have,
that's good.
You have an example of really bad authority in Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill, the response then is not anti-authority. I'm going to go away from this, but no, we need good authority. And ultimately that good authority is Christ. It's Jesus that we submit to and we come to and we worship and we love. So to reform rather than retreat, and run away.
And that was one of the, I was asked this multiple times by people. Why did you stay at your old church for so long? And that question almost offended me because I was like, because they're my family. And do I agree with everything going on? No, heck no. But I want to stay and be a voice for the people in that church because it's my church and it's my family. And these are my brothers and sisters. And if they're hurting, I, as their shepherd, and one of the shepherds is not going to just leave.
Right.
I want to be a part of the process, to fight for them, to fight alongside of them, to love and encourage them. And so, but I'm not saying that it's wrong to leave a church. And I think there's a time and a place to do just that. But as much as I can, until I guess my voice is no longer heard, I want to do that. It's also, I don't like a canceling culture. And so I'm a Christian. And because the grace that's been bestowed to me, this infinite and measurable grace, I want to move toward people continually with grace, which is really hard and really difficult. But I think the only way we're able to do that is to truly understand the amount of grace we've been given. And so like, I can move toward someone when they've offended me. I can continue to love people when they've offended me. And I think a lot of what we're seeing and what's coming out of this podcast and some things like that is like, I don't know that I feel grace or I see and hear and understand the gospel.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, you've listened to it all. Like, do you hear the gospel as the cure? Because that's what we need to ask always.
Right.
What's the solution? What are they saying needs to happen? What is the solution? And we would say
the gospel.
And I haven't listened to it. So you'd have to speak to that.
Yeah. I think the podcast does a good job of self-reflection and saying, okay, like we're talking about a guy and a church, but ultimately like we're a part of this as people who allow people like this to get into leadership. I'm trying to think back. And admittedly, I'm like halfway through the last episode. So Mike Cosper, if you ever listen to this, I apologize if I misquote you, but I think the pointed to solution, if there even is one, would be, greater accountability and greater like better leadership structures and that kind of thing. And so I don't know as though explicitly what comes through is the answer is the gospel and grace and forgiveness. And I think in cases like this, this is like always the pushback that comes up when you talk about forgiveness and grace, right? It's like, well, what about people who have hurt you really bad? And, does forgiveness mean that we have to reconcile with them? Does forgiveness mean that we have to just completely forget about the ways that they've hurt, which we would say no, right? That forgiveness doesn't necessarily always lead to reconciliation, nor should it in some instances. And I think instances of abuse are some of those, So, but yeah, I don't know as though, I think kind of the general public's response to the podcast as like a little bit of torches and pitchforks and like, give us more, would indicate not necessarily a whole lot of like, oh, where's grace and forgiveness and all of this? Which if you are someone who has been hurt in this way by a spiritual leader, it's tough to get there. Like we're not saying that you should just forget all that and forgive. Like there's work to be done in your heart and soul that is difficult to get to that place. But it's not impossible.
Yeah. From personal experience, I can tell you it's really hard to be mistreated by someone that you looked up to as a spiritual leader. Yeah. So
for sure.
Brad, we're about out of time. So how would you wrap this up?
Yeah, I would end with a quote actually from Charles Spurgeon, and it'll kind of be we're kind of going back to where we began. He says this: "The church is not perfect, but woe to the man who finds pleasure in pointing out her imperfections. Christ loved his church, and let us do the same. I have no doubt that the Lord can see more fault in his church than I can, and I have equal confidence that he sees no fault at all. Because he covers her faults with his own love, that love which covers a multitude of sins, and he removes all her defilement with that precious blood which washes away all the transgressions of his people." So I would conclude with that tension we began with, that The church is not perfect, but the church is the bride of Christ. And like Spurgeon says, Christ can see more imperfections and faults and mistakes and sin in our churches than we ever will be able to see.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, he sees none of it because his blood covers that. And man, that's a difficult tension that we have to live in, but it's the one that we get to walk in with help from the Spirit and with the truth of the gospel to continually come back to this place of I have been given grace and mercy and forgiveness that I do not deserve. And so how can I move to extend that to people in the same way that Christ has extended that to me? And that the church is not excused from that same kind of grace.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this episode on Saints in Society. We're thankful for you to take the time to listen, but also if you have any ideas or requests on podcasts that you would like to hear, we would love to hear from you. So feel free to write in, email us, contact us, because we would love to know what you guys would like to hear and provide the material for it.